Recently, I've turned 18. Which is very nice. Now that I'm a young adult, my limits are boundless and possibilities endless. I can drink, I can drive, I can party all night long, I can get married, I can go study, I can get a full-time job, I can declare a coup. Really, I'm not held back by anything. So what will I do with this newfound freedom, you may ask? Rome. Byzantium. The two empires that make history buffs like me blush at their mere mention. And yes, I meant two empires. Distinct ones. Now, ignoring the war I just started in the comments section, I'm not gonna bore you with a 5-minute long intro. I know why you're here, so I digress. This is a less serious video that I will dive into what made most of us Romaboos get into history. Big bloody battles, and the natural question we all ask ourselves when reading about Roman history. If the two greatest empires of the Mediterranean faced each other on the field, who would come out on top? Who would win on the field between the Roman war machine and the feared tagmata of the room? If you like this video, I recommend you like and subscribe, because this is probably one of my most ambitious videos yet, as I have needed the help of a fellow Byzantine history enthusiast to research and explain things in this video. So without further ado, let's get started. The first aspect of a battle between empires is to understand how they fought. Now, both had long and turbulent histories, thus battle tactics changed, so in this case I've chosen a specific battle formation for each that was most successful in their times. So for Rome, they will be fighting in the cohort or Marian system, while the Byzantines will be fighting in the Taxiarch or Nicephorian style. These are two extremely different styles of battle strategy, as they both depended heavily on very different groups of soldiers. The Romans depended on infantry, while the Byzantines depended on cavalry. That's not to say other variants of soldiers were abandoned, but that they had either less quality troops or suffered from simple neglect over time. But enough beating around the bush, let us begin our analysis. Let us begin our analysis on the OG world-conquering army, the Roman cohort system. The cohort system was in use for approximately 400 years, and was put in place in 107 BCE, before the foundation of the empire itself in the Republican era by Gaius Marius. His reasoning for replacing the old army system was to replace specifically the Roman maniple. Back in the day, you see, in a Roman maniple, each soldier had to buy his own kit, and his place in the formation would differ greatly on his wealth. This worked when Rome was only a mere regional power in Italy or Sicily, not when it was the dominant power in the Mediterranean. As more and more recruits were drafted into the ranks, many were too poor to afford good armor, thus too many cannon-fodder legions and not enough elite troops were effectively deployed. Gaius saw all the poor people and said, "Oh hell no," and began to reform the army. The main goal was to give each soldier the sufficient arms and armor to fight as a homogeneous unit, instead of multiple segregated groups. So what was the cohort system? Well, a Roman army in the imperial age had an estimate of 50 to 80,000 men. The army was a combination of 5 to 6 legions, who were the bread and butter of the Roman war machine, heavy infantry. Legions were composed of 4 to 5,000 professional troops, composed solely of Roman citizens and a few hundred non-citizen soldiers. The cohort system, to simplify, was an amalgamation of highly maneuverable centuriae, or infantry blocks of 80 men, each led by a head officer, the centurion. 6 of these centuriae made a cohort, and 10 cohorts were put into rows to complete the legion. The point of making a huge mass of centuriae like such was to use the weight of their numbers and discipline to pierce enemy lines, and the reason why the infantry were put into separate blocks instead of one massive line was to give more freedom to individual centurions to exploit situations, like a gap in the enemy formation, or flank the sides if opportunity arises. This independence of the centurions to contribute to battle effort was its greatest strength, as it made the army flexible in tight situations and won countless battles against future armies. The other parts of the army, like missile troops and cavalry, were handled quite differently, as citizens of Rome couldn't be stooped down to cowardly things like archery or horse riding. These roles in the army were taken up by non-citizen troops, foreign or local soldiers who were levied into the army to bolster the numbers of the main force. These troops were much more experienced in such fields, and were called auxiliaries. Infamous auxiliaries consisted of the Balearic slingers, Syrian archers, Celtic horsemen, Numidian peltasts, etc. The point of these troops was to make up for the failings of the legion. They were highly maneuverable, yes, but they weren't particularly fast, nor could they hold out against things like light troops or skirmishers, who could simply outrun any attempt by the legionaries to retaliate. Heavy infantry can't solve every problem on the battlefield, and Roman generals knew that. The beauty of the Roman auxiliaries was that the Roman army could exploit the greatest perk of a world-spanning empire: unit diversity. They could recruit the best archers, riders, slingers, or engineers of the Mediterranean without ever neglecting their core army, and exploit cultures for their martial prowess without neutering their new imperial subjects. But now for the real kicker: how did the Romans fight? Well, to make it simple, it was one main strategy: offensive and aggressive. The first line in the formation consisted often of light auxiliary troops that specialized in skirmishing. As the whole formation would slowly advance, these skirmishers were deployed to harass other light units of the enemy or soften the front line of the army by pelting them with javelins, lead balls, arrows, etc. As the main force of the army would get close, the legionaries in the second main line would use a wild card. Behind their shields were 3 javelins, or pila. They were only to be thrown meters away from the enemy. These pila were once more used to soften up the enemy lines, but also to pierce shields to stop enemy from countercharging. The infantry blocks of the cohort would smash into the enemy lines and viciously advance without mercy. Every few minutes, centurions would blow whistles or horns to sound infantry rotations, as exhausted frontline soldiers would run down the roads as fresh troops poured into the opened gaps. This main push in the battle was heavily morale-based, as a sort of shock tactic. Oftentimes the enemy would start routing at this point of the battle, but if the adversary commander was stubborn, then the Romans were far from finished. In case of possible flanking maneuvers, often reserves of either auxiliary troops or leftover centuriaes would be kept in the back, to block incoming cavalry charges. This is when auxiliary troops are most invaluable, as most of the cavalry forces in the Roman army were foreign by nature. Units such as the Gallic or Germanic cavalry were excellent light horsemen, and Eastern or Thessalian cavalry proved to be devastating heavy cavalry. These units would be used on the flanks of the army, and in battle the heavy cavalry was only used in the last stages, performing surgical level charges into weak points of the enemy flanks to weaken further their morale. If the army finally routs, the light cavalry would be deployed to finally clean up the cowards. The infantry by this point was often allowed to pursue the fleeing enemy, as they weren't experienced in futuristic concepts like feigned retreats, and such, the battle was often won, and little resistance stood at this stage on the other side of the Roman gladius, as tens of thousands lay dead on the field, having dared to stand in the way of the Roman war machine. The Roman legions were probably one of the most prestigious and feared armies in the world in its height, and for good reason. Its discipline and courage proved as successful as it was dangerous, and countless armies would cower in its might. But could this army hold up against its future predecessor from a millennium later? For this, I have brought a very special guest from another channel to help us explain the army of the future Byzantine Empire, Byzansimp.
For the purposes of this video, we have agreed to compare the armies of the classical and medieval Roman Empire at their primes, at their most iconic state. So, you will not talk about the legions of Belisarius and Mauricius, but the newly reformed elite forces of Nicephorus Phocas, the pale death of the Saracens, and Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, in the 10th to 11th century. Nicephorus organized his army to effectively counter and attack mainly one type of enemy, the Islamic enemies of the empire, from various border emirates. His army was heavily cavalry-based, focused on skirmishing and hammering the enemy with striking cavalry charges. Let us now examine how this formidable army worked on the battlefield, how the units were deployed, and how they dealt with the enemy. The army of Nicephorus was drawn from troops from the Themata and the Tagmata. The common light infantry soldiers were used as support. The heavy Manavalati spearmen were breakers of enemy cavalry charges. The archers, or Toxotai, gave cover to their comrades and did long-range attacks. The bulk of the infantry consisted of the Scutati, the Byzantine version of the hoplite. They were better equipped than common light infantry but were not as valorous or crucial as the Manavalati. Each carried a kite-shaped scudo for protection, hence their name. As for cavalry, the light riders, the Procrusatores, warded off enemy skirmishers and gave chase to the fleeing enemy. Regular cavalrymen acted as mounted archers, and the most crucial and well-equipped part of the Roman army, the Cataphractii, were unleashed at turning points of the battle and smashed into the enemy lines, spreading panic and disorder among their ranks. We haven't even mentioned the various supporting units working behind the lines and maintaining rank order. The workings of this army are meticulous, and Nicephorus commanders studied the military like a science, ancient and contemporary, to effectively lead it to victory. A major difference between the ancient and the medieval Roman army is their principle of war. Lacking the men and resources of their past empire, the medieval Romans dropped the aggressive attitude and resorted to tactics and strategies rather than overwhelming the enemy with force. They were mostly on the defensive side, and they huddled in a tight defensive formation and attacked only when the time was opportune, when a decisive victory was almost guaranteed. Or at least that was what the wiser commanders did. So, after reconnaissance and scouting done by the intelligence, the Romans would choose a suitable battleground and try to lure the enemy over. It was important to pick flat ground for battle. Once both sides are ready, battle will take place. The Romans mainly focused on two aspects of the battle, defense and offense. The troops were deployed in a square formation. 3 units, or taxiarchis, of infantry on each of its 4 sides, with intervals in between for the cavalry in the center to come and go, and for deploying the manavlati. This formation was used by the classical Romans before, and Nikephoros took the idea from his predecessors. Chosen for its defensive nature, for the large, tight 4-sided formation is difficult to be encircled by the enemy and will disperse them. Once again, we see the strict defensive nature of medieval Roman warfare. This is especially effective for defending against light cavalry, the orderly, tightly packed infantry. Forming a fulcon, the Byzantine version of the phalanx or the testudo, could easily repel the quick skirmishers who do not have much force in their disorderly attacks. But like the Romans, the Arabs also had very effective regular and heavy cavalry. What happens if they attack? The light infantry will be useless against them. That's where the heavily armed manavlati come in. They exit the square through the intervals and prepare themselves for impact. They were the human shields of the army, picked from the most courageous and steady men, equipped with long, heavy spears, positioning themselves in front of the regular infantry and absorbing the charge of the Arab cavalry. Their exceptional spears would break the charge, hopefully, and cripple the horses. 2 rows of manavlati will be deployed at first, while 2 more rows came from the opposite end, surprising the enemy cavalry with a sudden increase in the thickness of the defense line. Cavalry inside the square acted as support for the lines, and they had javeliners, archers, and light infantry to defend them as well. The common infantrymen, of course, held firm their formation. On the offensive side of warfare, the infantry really had little role, and crushing the enemy became the job of the fearsome Roman cavalry. Phocas would send the procursatores to skirmish with the enemy forces to open battle if the enemy remained in formation. Usually, the regular and heavy cavalry will be deployed only when the enemy became weak and disorganized, probably after facing manavlati, because the commander had just 1 shot during the battle to decisively beat the enemy, and the cavalry force could only be deployed once for a strike. So, having seized the opportune moment, the cavalry will be deployed as such. Usually, there were 5,000 or 6,000 riders in total, but the elite of the elite, the cataphracti, only numbered 500 or less. They were placed front and center, in the middle of the first line of cavalry, with 2 regular escorting units on their sides. Procrusatores acted as outflankers on the line's right wing and flank guards against the enemy outflankers on the line's left wing. Coordination between the versatile procrusatores and deadly cataphracti was the absolute key to the success of the attack. After skirmishing with the enemy forces, testing out their strength, and beating any enemy skirmishers who wished to disrupt the cohesion and momentum of the cataphracti, the light riders would retire through the intervals or go on to shield the flanks of the one whose time it is to shine. The cataphracti, the most iconic unit of the Nicephorian army. Let's discuss their unique formation first. The cataphracti proceeded in a blunt triangular wedge formation, like a spearhead, corresponding to their nature as the elite shock troops that dealt a devastating blow. They will choose a point of impact to drive into the enemy formation, usually aiming the blow at the commander of the enemy forces, who should be situated around the same place as the Roman commander. Take out the head and you will destroy the resolve of the whole army. On the subject of projectiles and archers, there is something to say on the ranged units and weaponry of the Romans. Archers, javeliners, and slingers were obviously the most common types, but there was also a unit wielding a unique Byzantine weapon that spread extreme terror on the battlefield, the grenadiers and flamethrowers. These troops handled the deadly Greek fire with mastery, containing the substance in ceramic grenades or in portable siphons and unleashing hell on the enemy. Though deployment of such troops and use of these devices were rare, their effect was unsurprisingly devastating for the enemy. Phocas ordered them to launch volleys of fire grenades or unleash the flamethrowers into the enemy ranks to disrupt them and induce anxiety in them before the Roman cavalry charged. Phocas advised his commanders to use Greek fire only when the enemy had the advantage, as a wild card. One must appreciate the Romans' military technology and ingenuity in war at the mention of these seemingly fantastical weapons. Another wild card of the Byzantine Empire were the Hetairai, or mercenaries. a new division of the army that was not implemented by Phocas but actually future emperors like Basil II and Alexius Komnenos. This was the mercenary corps. The Byzantine army was known for exploiting the advantages of foreign units even back in classical times. The mercenary corps was as diverse as it was useful, as foreign troops could not only bolster the numbers of the army but contribute to other weaker aspects of the army like heavy infantry or light troops. Some of the most well-known mercenaries of the Atari were, for example, the Varangian Guard, the Turkic Horse Archers, and Norman Knights. This mercenary corps was the perfect way to exploit one of Byzantium's greatest traits over the ages, deep pockets. They were one of their greatest strengths in their prime, but will also be their downfall in the future. In the unlikely case that the enemy repels the cataphracti, the rest of the cavalry and the procursores would immediately come to their aid and escort them back to the infantry square. But for the most part, a well-planned cataphracti strike would shatter the enemy and send them retreating, and it would have seemed like the day was won. The soldiers were free to break away from formation, pursue the terrified enemies, and do some well-deserved looting, right? Right? Well, no. Pursuit of the enemy was left to the procursores until the rout of the enemy was absolutely certain and made sure no other enemies were in vicinity. Often in the past, the Romans were victims to feigned retreats while battling with steppe nomads and the infamous Bulgars, and they have learned their lesson. Never pursue those devious horse archers who might suddenly turn around and turn the tides of the battle. Even when the enemy was completely sure to be defeated, the commander will still keep most cavalry units in reserve and let only a few go off for the chase. Nikephoros' focus was extremely clear and severe about a point. No plundering. Here we see one of the most important reasons for the Nicephorian army's success. Phocas made damn sure his men were disciplined as hell. They were not to give in to their greed and bloodlust, but must always remain in formation during the battle and heed their commander. Phocas' men were intensely trained to be calm, courageous, loyal, disciplined warriors from the start. So we see an army physically and spiritually superior to their enemies, led by excellent commanders such as Phocas and his nephew Ioannis Themiskis, who inspired the troops greatly. This army was no less professional and loyal than the legions of Caesar or Trajan, so if the Romai and the Romani ever met on the battlefield, it would not be an easy fight.
So what would a battle between titans look like? Well, lucky for you, thanks to the analysis of me and Byzansimp, we can now find out as we travel back to a new world where such a battle can take place. We find ourselves in the Epirot Plains in what is modern-day Albania. Both great armies find themselves on opposite sides of a great flat plain, as neither of the two combatants would hold an advantage on uneven ground. The great army of Byzantium has mustered a great force of 50,000 strong, the largest of its existence, only rivaled in size back in the days of Justinian and Heraclius. The army of Rome, however, numbering a towering 60,000 troops, was typical for an invasion force in its time. Both armies faced the other, begging each other to make the first move, but after hours of tense silence, the Romans could not take any more inaction. They sound the war horns and whistles for an advance. The battle has begun. The slow advance of the Romans gives time for the Byzantines to start making a move. Small groups of procursores and mercenary horse archers begin to exit through the gaps of the square. The famed auxiliary Balearic slingers on the front do their best to hold off the light troops of the enemy, but the procursores and Turkic horse archers outmatch the Romans, and the legionaries can only watch helplessly in the back as any attempt to counterattack are evaded. The Roman slingers are slaughtered by the Byzantine light cavalry in the front. The Roman general is not fazed by this, and does not halt the advance. He then orders his own cavalry to begin following the infantry on the flanks to avoid any flanking maneuvers by the Greek pretenders. Even though the horse archers continue to pelt the front line and sides, they can do little to halt the advance of the massive legionaries. The Roman Gallic cavalry begin to ward off the horse archers from the flanks, as the Byzantine Turkic cavalry evade their attacks. The procursores begin to re-enter the square to rest, having finished their first objective. The Byzantine toxotoi are finally in range of the legionaries, and begin shooting in volleys. Hundreds of arrows would fall into the enemy ranks. This barely phases the infantry, as they draw ever closer. The Byzantine commander tells his subordinates to begin readying the cataphracti, and the grenadiers, as the Roman masses draw ever nearer to their front line. The two infantry lines are both 10 meters away from each other. The legionaries ready their pila, waiting to throw them at the moment's notice. Only an instant later, thousands upon thousands of iron javelins are thrown at the Byzantine scutati. This devastates the Byzantines, and the weight of so many pila pierce shields, mail and lamella alike. After a moment to recuperate, the Romans charge at the Byzantine front line. The strength and discipline of the scutati and Manavaliti barely hold back the Roman charge, but they still stand strong. Some centurions attempt to bring their men into the gaps of the square formation, but the instant they enter the gaps, they are bombarded with a hail of fiery explosions by grenades, flamethrowers, and other projectiles. The clash on the front line is brutal, as hundreds die every moment on both sides, but the Romans continue to push and begin to gain ground. The Byzantine falcon is beginning to crack. The Byzantine Strategos waits for the whole infantry mass of the legions to be committed to the fight, as he waits patiently in order to strike with his cataphracti. But he is unsure if his infantry can hold long enough. After the sound of the horn, the crown jewel of Byzantium, the cataphracti, rode out the flanks of the square in a triangular formation. They started to ride around the main fight. Seeing from afar, the Roman general orders the reserves of his heavy Thessalian cavalry to crush the counterattack. But with the help of the precursores and horse archers on the sides of the cataphract formations, the Byzantines are simply no match. The Roman auxiliaries are routed with barely a fight, as the glimmering men of iron that were the cataphracti crush any resistance. The Roman general, also in the back with his reserves, is shocked by the mass of routing cavalry in his terrifying advance. Charging straight at him, if he stays, he will surely die where he stands, but seeing no honor retreating, he and a collection of auxiliaries and his bodyguards finish with a desperate charge in the wave of iron. He would be one of the first to fall, as he was hit on the neck by a mace and trampled as he fell off his horse. Little did they realize that the main engagement was not going as smoothly. After what seemed to be hours of fighting, the Byzantine front begins to slowly collapse. Officers and commanders tried desperately to keep order in the ranks, but it was near impossible, as the legionaries cut down anyone who stood in their way. The mercenary reserves, such as the Varangian Guard, would try to desperately plug as many holes in the front line, but it was near impossible. Only a miracle could save them, as the front line was maybe moments from starting a full rout. That was until the word on the other side started to take place. The general was dead. Centurions and commanders alike did what they could to keep the morale of the troops to not falter, but it was too late. The pace of the legionaries would not slow down, but the resistance by the scutati and Manavaliti began to hold, as the hope of the cavalry arriving began to inspire a second wind. This was to become reality, as not long after, in the near distance, the noise of galloping and iron clamoring over itself could be heard by the legionaries. The cataphracti would make a devastating charge upon the flank, cutting deep into the Roman ranks. Hundreds of legionaries would die in the first moments of the charge. Seeing no reason to continue, the legionaries' morale shattered, and are in full rout. The battle was won. A battle between the Romans and Byzantines would be brutal to say the least, but in my opinion, the Byzantines would hold an edge, as their superior cavalry would easily rout the Roman cavalry. Thus the cataphractes and the precursores would be free to roam the field without resistance, making surgical charges into the side and back of the main infantry corps of the Romans. This, of course, is only my opinion, and if you disagree, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. I would like to thank Byzansimp for her contributions to this video, as her help was very useful in the research, and her knowledge in Byzantine history was invaluable. If you like this video and want to see a similar kind of content, I recommend you like and subscribe, as this is Untold History Animations. Thank you for watching.